Cinematic lighting is about intention. It's about understanding contrast and executing your vision with precision. IRE and false color are powerful tools. They help us expose correctly. But exposure alone doesn't shape light. When the difference between a good shot and a great shot lives in subtle shift of contrast, you need a way to measure those differences. Cinematographers rely on something else. They think in stops, and they speak in stops. Because stops aren't tied to a monitor or a picture profile. They're tied to light itself. Well, in this video, we'll break down what stops actually are and why they're still the universal language on professional sets. Once you understand how stops link everything together, you won't just expose correctly, you'll start shaping light with intention. Let's dive right in. Before we talk about stops, we need to understand something important. IRE and false color are powerful exposure tools. They help us place skin tones correctly and protect highlights. But proper exposure is not enough. You can have a perfectly exposed image that still feels flat, uncontrolled, and unintentional. So what's the difference between these two shots? Both are exposed correctly. The difference here is contrast, the relationship between highlights, midtones, and shadow. Unfortunately, I shot this one a few years ago before I truly understood contrast and intentional lighting. So the real question becomes, what can I do as a cinematographer to intentionally create more contrast, to control the gap in brightness between the background, my subject, maybe the shadow, and the highlights on the person's face? And more importantly, how do I measure the contrast so I can replicate it across multiple interviews or scenes and keep my work consistent? Well, that's where stops comes in. So what exactly is a stop? At its core, a stop is simply a doubling or halving of light. If I double the amount of light hitting my subject, that's one stop brighter. If I cut that light in half, that's one stop darker. Stops are measured relative to middle gray. Every digital camera is calibrated around middle gray, commonly referred to as 18% gray. It's called 18% gray just because it reflects approximately 18% of the light that hits it, compared to pure white, which reflects nearly all of it. Why 18%? Well, simply because it represents the tonal midpoint between black and white, in a way that aligns closely with how human vision perceives brightness. It's the reference point that all camera uses to determine proper exposure. Middle gray is the anchor. When we talk about being one stop over or two stops under, we're describing how far we are from that reference point. That's why stops are universal. It doesn't matter if you're shooting on a Sony, an ARRI, a RED, or a Canon. Every camera measures dynamic range in stops above and below middle gray. When a camera claims 14 stops of dynamic range, that means it can see a certain number of stops above middle gray before highlights clip, and a certain number of stops below middle gray before shadows start crushing the blacks and you lose all the details. But stops aren't just something your sensor measures. They're the common measurement built into every tool and every setting you use. Look at your lens. Every time you adjust your aperture, you're moving in stops. If I go from f4 to f2.8, I'm doubling the amount of light hitting the sensor. That's one stop brighter. Each full stop on your lens represents a doubling or halving of light. And that pattern is consistent across every lens, every camera system, and every manufacturer. That's not a monitoring tool, that's physics. It's important to understand the full stop scale. And there's a simple way to remember it. If you memorize the first two values, 1 and 1.4, you can build the rest of the table by doubling each sequence. 1 becomes 2, 1.4 becomes 2.8, 2 becomes 4, 2.8 becomes 5.6, 4 becomes 8, 5.6 becomes 11, 8 becomes 16, 11 becomes 22. And just like that, you now know the full stop table. These numbers may look random at first, but they're all representing equally one stop change in light, meaning half or doubling the amount of light that hits the sensor when you adjust your lens. The same principle applies to ISO. Changing ISO by one full stop either doubles or halves the sensor's sensitivity to light. If you move from ISO 400 to ISO 800, that's one stop brighter. If you move from ISO 800 to ISO 400, that's one stop darker. Now, many modern cinema cameras today use native ISO or dual native ISO system, And in log workflow, we often shoot at a fixed base ISO for maximum dynamic range. But even then, stops are still at work. If you're shooting in Cine EI or using exposure index, your EI adjustment moves in stops. Let's say your camera native ISO is 800, like my FX6. If you set your EI to 400, that's one stop lower than native. You're not changing how the sensor records light, you're changing how the image is displayed to you. By setting your EI one stop lower, the monitor image appears darker, which encourages you to open up your exposure by one stop. In other words, you're intentionally overexposed the recorded images by one stop relative to middle gray. And if you're confused about that, I have a full video on ISO and exposure index. Again, the same principle applies to shutter speed. Shutter controls how long light hits the sensor, and just like aperture and ISO, it moves in stop. If I go from 1/50th of a second to a 100th of a second, I'm cutting the exposure time in half. That's one stop darker. If I go from 100th of a second to 1/50th, I'm doubling the exposure time. That's one stop brighter. In cinema, we often think in shutter angle instead of shutter speed, but the concept is identical. If you use ND filters, it also works the same way. Whether you're adjusting aperture, ISO, or shutter, or even your ND filter, you're always moving in stops. Different tools, same language. And that's the point. Stops aren't just an exposure concept. They're the measurement system underneath every exposure control on every single camera. When it comes to contrast, it's also measured in stops. Now let's take a look at this shot. The object has no contrast. Both sides of the object, the key side and the field side, are exactly at the same level. If we look at our false color, it looks identical across the board. Now we have contrast between the background and the object, but I want us to focus on the object itself. We want to create some contrast between both sides of the object. So if I reduce the fill side light in half from 100% intensity to 50% intensity, that now gives us one stop difference between each side. That would be what we call a 2-to-1 contrast ratio. We often just call it ratio, meaning the bright side is twice as bright as the dark side. If I reduce the fill by half again to now 25% intensity, the fill is now 2 stops under the key. That means it's receiving 1/4 of the light of the key, which gives us a 4-to-1 ratio. Now we can keep reducing the fill light in half to change our contrast ratio until we have what we actually want. As cinematographers, we have to decide before the shoot how much contrast we want. Do we want something soft and open or dramatic and sculpted? Contrast shapes mood, it builds tension, it guides how the audience feels. Once you know the level of contrast you want, you can communicate it clearly. You might say, I want a 4-to-1 ratio on the actor's face, or let's bring the fill 2 stops on the key. A gaffer immediately understands what that means and can execute your vision precisely. But what if you don't have a gaffer? How do you actually measure those stops? Some monitors now offer the EL zone system. It may look similar to false color, but instead of mapping IRE values, it maps the image in stop increments relative to middle gray. Each color represents a specific number of stops above or below that reference point. That makes it a powerful way to visualize exposure in terms of stops instead of percentages. The challenge is that the EL zone system is only available on a limited number of cameras and monitors. And that's what led me to the next step. I recently bought a light meter because if stops are the universal language of light, I wanted a tool that measures lights directly in stops, independent of the camera or monitor. The truth is, you don't need a light meter. You can create great work without one, and you can still expose using stop without it. But if you want a precise way to measure different areas of your scene and clearly define their relationships in terms of exposure and contrast, this is the next step. At its most basic level, a light meter allows you to enter your ISO, frame rate, and your shutter speed or shutter angle, and it will tell you what aperture you need to properly expose middle gray. You can also lock in an aperture and it will tell you what shutter speed would produce the correct exposure. But if you've seen some of my previous video, you know I'm all about control, and I'm not about to use a light meter to tell me what setting I should use creatively. I decide what my aperture, my shutter, and my ISO should be based on the look that I want. The depth of field, the motion rendering, the dynamic range, those are creative choices. I use the meter to adjust my lighting to match those decisions, and that's a big shift. Instead of changing the camera to match the light, I shape the light to match the camera settings I've chosen intentionally. Let's take a look at this shot. My camera is set to ISO 800, which is its native ISO. My frame rate is set to 2398. My shutter speed is set to 1/60th of a second, and I've chosen an aperture of f2.8. Those are creative decisions. That's the look that I want. Now, if you have a light meter, you don't actually need a gray card. I'm going to use one here simply to verify what the meter is telling us. I'm monitoring through a Rec. 709 LUT, not S-Log3. You can monitor in log, but the curve is compressed, which makes it harder to see subtle differences using false color or waveform. Rec. 709 spread the tonal value out, giving us a clear reference. If we look at a waveform, we can see that our gray card is actually underexposed. In Rec. 709, middle gray should sit around 41 IRE. Right now, it's sitting just above 20 IRE. So let's take a meter reading. The meter tells us that at ISO 800 and 1/60th shutter, proper exposure should require an aperture of 2. But I don't want to shoot at f2. I want to stay at 2.8. So instead of changing the camera, I need to change the light. What's the difference between f2 and f2.8? Remember the stops table? From 2 to 2.8 is 1 stop. So I need to add 1 stop of light to the scene. I've already dialed in the light earlier at 4% intensity. So I'll take another reading, and if everything is correct, the meter should now read f2.8, matching the aperture I've chosen on the camera. And there it is. Now we know that middle gray is exposed correctly. But let's double check our work by using the waveform. Our gray card is now sitting right around 41 IRE in Rec. 709, exactly where we want middle gray to be. Let's bring the subject in. Exposure looks good, but what about contrast? To measure contrast precisely, we need to understand the difference between incident and reflected light. Incident light is the light falling onto the subject. It measures how much light is reaching the object, regardless of what the object looks like. Reflected light is the light bouncing off that object back towards the camera. This light meter can measure both. With the dome extended, it measures incident light. With the scope, it measures reflected light. That allows me to point at any specific area and measure the intensity of the light bouncing off of it. When using the spot, it's important to position it as close to the lens as possible so you're measuring from the same angle the camera sees. Let's measure the bright side of our subject. The meter reads f5.6. Since middle gray was exposed at 2.8, that means the bright side is 2 stops above middle gray. From 2.8 to 4 is 1 stop, from 4 to 5.6 is another stop. Now let's measure the opposite side of the object. Right now, it also reads 5.6. That tells us there's essentially no contrast between the two sides. So to create contrast, we need to remove light from one side. I'll introduce some negative fill using a black cloth to absorb light and create shadows. Now let's measure again. Now the bright side we haven't touched, so it still reads at 5.6. Let's measure the shadow side. Using the meter's contrast function, it will calculate the difference in stops between the first reading and the second reading. We can see that the shadow side is approximately 2.4 stops darker than the bright side, which translates to roughly a 5:1 contrast ratio. Now we've intentionally created and measured contrast, not guessed it, measured it. Now using the scope, I can quickly measure contrast between any area in the frame. I can compare the object to the white wall, the object to the dark bookshelves, or the darkest part of the image to the window, for example. Talking about the window, let's make sure that we're not clipping our highlights. If I take a spot reading of the window, the meter reads f8. Middle gray was exposed at 2.8, so from 2.8 to 4 is 1 stop, from 4 to 5.6 is 2 stops, from 5.6 to 8 is 3 stops. That means the window is 3 stops above middle gray. Now if we look at the dynamic range chart for the Sony FX6, in S-Log3 Cine EI at native ISO, Sony rates the camera at roughly 6 stops above middle gray before clipping. So at 3 stops over, we're well within the dynamic range, far away from clipping the highlights. And that's why you can still see the texture in the curtain instead of a blown out white shape. The same logic applies to the shadow. If I measure the darkest part of the blue chair, for example, the meter reads F1. From 1 to 1.4 is 1 stop, from 1.4 to 2 it's 2 stops, from 2 to 2.8 is 3 stops. That means the darkest part of the chair is 3 stops below middle gray. So again, we're well within the camera's dynamic range. Working this way makes it possible to match the look of one scene to the next and maintain the same contrast ratio across an entire film. When you think and speak in stops, you're no longer relying on a specific monitor, LUT, or camera profile. You're working from a universal reference point, and that makes you a more versatile DP. You can step into any camera system and expose with confidence without needing to memorize where middle gray sits in IRE for that particular setup, because you're no longer thinking in percentages, you're thinking in relationship. You understand how many stops over your highlights are, how many stops under your shadow falls, and how much contrast exists between them. And that's the shift. IRE helps you monitor exposure, stops helps you shape light. And once you start thinking in stop, your lighting becomes intentional, repeatable, and easy to communicate. And that's why cinematographer thinks in stop, not just in IRE. Thank you for watching this video until the end. If this helped clarify how stops connect everything in cinematography, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more practical breakdown like this one. And if you want to go deeper into camera settings, check out my online course and start taking real control of your images. Thanks again, and happy filming.